Dust off your back, don't look back. Give all the dollars, you know a fake heart attack. 'Cause you were made for this. You can feel it inside your bones. You were made for this, and it's time you let the world know who you are, what you know, it's happening right now. So run, run, it's a new day.
Kylie, welcome to Starve Asia. And for those of you who may not know Kylie or what he's doing, could you just introduce yourself and 500 Durians?
Yeah, okay. Well, funny people are talking about 500 Durians. It originally began as kind of a joke, right? So Dave and I were thinking, all right, we're going to set up this micro fund for Southeast Asia. We're going to do the SEC filing, really serious stuff, okay? We're going to, it's going into, well, let's give it a name. What do we call it? 500 Startup Southeast Asia Fund. No, let's call it 500 Durians, right? Put it in. Then the press took it and says, oh, 500 startups launching a 500 Durians fund, right? And then the name started to stick. But what it really is, 500 Durians is actually a $10 million fund, micro fund, out of 500 startups that's focused specifically on Southeast Asia. But really, it's still 500 startups.
Okay. So, I mean, you've been active for a few months and traveling around Southeast Asia. So, what have you been up to the last few months? And, have you been in Indonesia a lot and meeting startups and so on?
Yeah, the past couple of months have been very interesting for me because I would describe it as a learning journey. I think Southeast Asia is growing at such and evolving at such a rapid clip that that I have to learn a lot very, very fast just to do my job, to be able to understand and help and pick good startups to invest in and to help a lot. And being an investor, contrasting that against my entrepreneurial experience, like I'm just noticing the patterns, like how there's a lot of different ways to be a really good investor versus being a really good entrepreneur. Whoa, like that.
Someone farted.
For example, sound effects that happen in the background while you speak. I mean,
Yeah.
because in my kind of the entrepreneurial past, right? When I built two companies, which whoa, is that me? Okay. So in 4 years, I built two companies. One I sold to Groupon, and another one I sold to a public listed media company called Catch Up Media. In building those two companies, I think Remco just now was talking about aggressive and aggression, and these days terms which float around like growth hacking. Or how do you make? I mean, if you've raised say 500 grand or you raise $1 million or whatnot, how do you use that money to produce more growth in a shorter amount of time?
Yeah.
That's the stuff which is really exciting for founders, as they want to push and drive these things, right?
Yeah.
So now what I'm looking at when investing and working with startups is how do you actually create that kind of growth, like super fast growth in a short amount of time, and learning how to do that in different markets. That's interesting to me.
Okay. So, as an investor, I mean, you just got into the game and you were an entrepreneur. Could you talk about what's some of the things that you're looking for in an entrepreneur, in a founder? Is it about expertise? Is it about a certain X factor?
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. It's a good question. I mean, as I mentioned to you, you asked the first question about what have I been up to the past couple of months, and I mentioned to you I've been on a learning journey.
Yeah.
So part of that is also learning what I should be looking for.
Right.
Right. So I'll tell you a few things which I've found. And of course, there are the general things, of course, idea, the market, the founders. I mean, we can talk about the fundamentals of what's going to make a really good business or investment. But I want to talk about some of the more nuanced things which I've discovered made me invest in a startup or not. Now, the first one is about authenticity. And it's something I don't think people talk about a lot, right? I don't, maybe they do, right? I'm not sure. But being really authentic when you speak about your startup to a potential investor, or the way you present your startup, authenticity, the integrity behind your numbers. I had conversations with some founders who are kind of selling me on their traction, and when I'm just asking simple questions about their metrics or their traction, they're kind of clouding it. And you kind of know when somebody's trying to cloud something,
Right.
And it's not like I'm gonna, you don't have traction, I'm just gonna walk away and don't talk to you, man. Like, I just wanna know what's happening now. with you at your point. What are you struggling with? What challenges are you facing? And with a lot of startups which I've already invested in, I kind of worked with them for weeks or months. You know, I meet them, I see them at one point. You know, I get on calls with them, I work with them till they get to the next point. You know, and if they, every time I talk to them, they just keep showing more growth. That's really attractive to me. But in the first conversation, if you're already trying to cloud me and not being honest about what the challenges are and what challenges you're facing, the things you know and things you're convinced about, versus the things you don't know and you're trying to test, it's going to be hard for me to help you. It's going to be hard for me to feel I can trust you. And I pass on deals like everything's supposed to look good, you know, and you know, but if you're just not a real person.
Yeah. So I mean, in the Indonesian context, so we've been speaking to founders here, is that a very common quality, or do you think in terms of the culture of the founders in Indonesia, for example, like what can be improved then among them?
Well, I think if you relate it back to this authenticity and just kind of being real, right? Just being real. What I find is that some Indonesian founders that I meet, they have, because maybe they've pumped out a product, and because they haven't raised money for it yet, they do a lot of agency work. They outsource, they freelance, they do a lot of freelancing stuff, and I'm sure some of you in this room do that as well. So when I'm speaking to some of them, if they're honest about how much time they're spending struggling with the freelancing thing, how they can't focus on their startup, versus telling me of how they're like focusing on their startup 90% of the time, and maybe after 2 conversations, they're like, oh yeah, by the way, you know, we also have this app building factory that we do jobs. So, yeah, I mean, it's yeah, but again, I think we're talking about this authenticity point. Maybe I'm talking about that point a bit too much, right? But I'm just saying that these are some of the nuanced things which I kind of relate to.
An interesting point you brought up in our conversation before this was this idea of inner game growth hacking. So it's the first time I'm hearing this term from anyone. I mean, I've never heard of this. Could you explain what it means and how it applies to startups?
Okay. This is fun. This is one of my favorite topics in the world. So I was basically talking to Terrence here back then about how a lot of these startup conferences talk a lot about tactics, strategies, what you did, you know, and a lot of the what I call the outer game stuff. But there is a whole world of inner game, right? Of your belief systems, how you manage yourself emotionally, how do you the way you look at your world, the way you look at yourself, the kind of internal conditioning, which is your inner game, the personality. I mean, it kind of bleeds into the world of personal growth. Some terms that people don't like as much as like self-help, you know, and stuff like that. But there's a whole world of things that founders grow into and learn a lot from, which is about just their belief systems and the way they look at the world. And a lot of conferences don't tackle this stuff, the soft side of startups, if you will.
So what kind of topics do you think in the future Asia could do? Like inner
Well, for example, like talking just now, for example, we had a chat, like the Fireside chat just now with Remco. I don't know if you're still in the room. Like what I would be curious about was kind of the emotional journey of how you matured as a founder.
Right.
What kind of belief systems were shattered along the way as your company grew? Because my observation about my previous startup experiences was that the size of the startup, the size of how large my company grew was in direct correlation of how big of a person I had to grow into. How big of my mindset, how open, how large my heart would have to grow into to be able to, it had a direct correlation.
Okay.
If a very small-minded and petty person, or person who's plagued by his insecurities, or you know, it's going to be very difficult for the person to sustain and to evolve with the size of a startup as it grows into larger companies.
Okay. So maybe we'll go back to that, but let's address right now, since the more outer game stuff, right? So what kind of startups are you looking for right now and in Indonesia and as well as in Southeast Asia, and what are the areas that are interesting to you? Yeah.
Well, there's 2 things I look at. The first one is that 500 startups in general, we're kind of very practical investors in the sense that we kind of look out for people who have clear revenue models, you know, with a model that's easily understandable. It's not to say we're avoiding startups which grow a lot of users and have no revenue model, but is that we have a preference leaning towards something that starts off that works in a small context, but you can build it into something much bigger. So I'm okay with a smaller idea. We can work together and make it bigger. I'm okay with working on a model which is proven in a lot of other countries, and you're bringing it in and adapting it to the local situation. I'm not afraid of that. In fact, I think it's fantastic. It's kind of like a low-hanging fruit. I just call it the low-hanging fruit business models,
Okay.
The stuff which has worked previously elsewhere that you haven't brought in. So I'm not afraid of that stuff. Call it cloning, whatever. If you attach too much ego to this whole originality thing, you might be kind of blinding yourself to the opportunities, the low-hanging fruit opportunities in front of you. So there's one cluster of opportunities I kind of look out for, comparing with other markets, what kind of is going to work very well here. The second one, which are things which are, you can call it as like unique to Indonesia or unique to whatnot. Not too many things are overly that unique these days, but there are certain unique executions of foreign models or like just wild inventions. For example, when I built says.com, like one of my companies, wherever I traveled, I didn't really find any other business model quite like it. But then my other company was a Groupon clone. So I see that it's possible from personal experience that you can succeed by cloning something and you can succeed by inventing something as well.
But is that what Southeast Asia needs? Let me explain in the sense that there are so many investors who are sort of looking at these kind of ideas. Okay, importing something from Silicon Valley into Asia and trying to tweak the execution, how it works. So, do you think that's really what Southeast Asia needs, or do they need investors who are sort of looking for the big idea that may not make money in the next 2-3 years, but gradually you never know, right? So, and some more, we can talk in terms of your connections to 500 Durians with the whole Silicon Valley ecosystem. So, what are your thoughts on that?
So your question is kind of like, okay, what does Southeast Asia really need? They just really need more clones.
Do they
Asking?
really need 500 Durians and sort of the lower hanging fruits you're going after?
Yeah, you know what? I'll tell you what Southeast Asia needs. Southeast Asia, because things are evolving so rapidly, founders need to just learn and absorb best practices really rapidly. Right? And I am agnostic to the uniqueness or originality of ideas. I'm more obsessed about whether or not the company can grow very quickly and whether or not we can pump in global knowledge, global mentors, global access, global capital, bring in other follow-on investors from other parts of the world into a startup and just blow it up and make it big.
Okay.
So I don't differentiate. Basically, that's what I'm trying to say. And I'll give you like real examples because not all kind of cloned things work. I don't know if anyone's in a room attempting the Birch box, Glossy box, Lola box, whatever box, right? Kind of model, right? But I've seen certain founders tackle with Southeast Asian challenges where a lot of the FMCG or the beauty manufacturers, it's like they just don't have that size. They just don't produce a lot in that size. So it makes a natural limit to the kind of the economics of sampling. So these are things which in Southeast Asia, adapting it has more challenges. So not all of it's going to work anyway, right? So I think if I just take that, is it a cloned model or is it something unique and original? I just throw that stuff out the window and I just look at the business as a business. What is forcing it to be challenging? What is driving its growth? And try and solve things and look at things from that level. I feel like it gives me more clarity, and I'm hoping that it helps founders get more clarity of what they're trying to do as well.
So I guess a clone is fine as long as it's practical for Southeast Asia. Let's say in spite of its geographical boundaries and so on.
Yeah, it's like don't get hung up. Don't get hung up on whether it's a clone or not a clone. Okay. So like for example, my team, after we sold the company to Groupon, a lot of my team, they're taking care of Groupons in other countries, right? So the feedback I get from them is that they saw how different countries like Korea and so on and so forth, right? They started off by cloning the group buying model, but they evolved so fast. Right, and you look at them now; they don't look even anything like group buying anymore. But they're kicking Groupon ass because they've managed to kind of adapt much faster. So I think seeing that, is it a clone, uniqueness, whatnot? If you're coming from that perspective, it's so distracting. You just look at what your users are using, see what's working, double down on what's working, and I think that's a more useful perspective.
Okay, so in terms of if we talk in terms of bringing ideas into Asia and adapting to the local context, a lot of it has been beaten to death, like e-commerce. So many people are doing e-commerce. If you talk about Birchbox, clones, there are a couple in Indonesia and all around Asia. So, what idea would you like to see being executed in Southeast Asia and Indonesia that you haven't been seeing a lot of that you think could work?
Okay, I'll start with what is harder for it, like this whole kind of bringing things in, importing models or whatnot, doesn't work as well. 500 startups have not invested in too many games, and that's mostly because I don't think we add too much value to games. And personally, it's like what I see for Southeast Asia is that someone in Indonesia, they're playing a lot of global games. Games produced by Japan, Korea, US, you name it, right? So having a local version of Angry Birds or local version of Candy Crush, it doesn't work out quite the same way. So that's one. So I think for gaming, it doesn't apply that much. I think a lot of opportunity is enterprise services. I think that what a lot of companies are doing now, the services that in the US, right, that works very well, maybe local companies, a lot of them have not adopted that yet. So I can't reveal which startup this is, right, because they're working on their own press, so I don't want to bust their press run, but they're going to announce it soon. So I've made an investment in a company which provides a certain service to enterprise. And it's a clone. In the US, the competing models have already raised up to, the leading one raised up to $50 million US, and they're on track towards what would be a good IPO company. So I'm investing in the the Southeast Asian version of it. And it's shocking that all these enterprises, even though they're the same, like say Accenture or something, right? They're same in the US, the same over here in Southeast Asia, but Southeast Asia arms aren't using that yet. And they're waiting to use that. So I think there's a lot of opportunity in enterprise.
Yeah.
In terms of e-commerce, I'm not so bullish about e-commerce these days. Maybe it's from personal experience, I don't know. But it's kind of I see the margins thinning, custom acquisition costs are going up. So there are, of course, there's still pockets where it's easy to do it, but I'm not as bullish on e-commerce.
Okay. For your upcoming unannounced investments, any of them in Indonesia, right? Are they Indonesian companies?
Well, before I joined, Dave invested in Craved, right? Who's out there. So they've kind of cloned something and is adapting it, and I think they're doing pretty well right now. I've recently just caught up with them. But part of the 500 Durian allocation is that I have not invested in an Indonesian company yet. Although, as I mentioned to you, the way I kind of invest is that I just meet companies and I work with them for a few months before I kind of, pull the trigger.
That's interesting.
So I'm already kind of working with a lot of you guys in the room. So.
Okay. So meaning you've been working with startups in Indonesia for a few months, certain startups, but you have not invested and you want to see if it's... could you elaborate on that? Like just your whole process of how you decide on an investment, and you mentioned it take a few months, and there's this whole thing about finding out whether they are authentic and what's their inner life like. So
I'll give you the simple one, right? Let's say you're a founder and you pitch me something today, right? What I'm going to do is I'm going to just talk to you about your startup, really understand what's it about and what drives its growth, what's going to make you win, and what's going to stop you from winning. Okay, it's the first thing. Second thing I do is that, okay, so let's talk about how do we allocate the little resources you have, but in a different sequence. You may be doing 5 things to grow your startup right now, but I'm saying, okay, why not let's focus on these 2 things, but we kind of, do these 2 things a little bit better, and we test the 3rd thing later. Or I come up with a 6th thing, for example. So we go through kind of like a discussion around growth hacking. How do you produce more results? I'm like, okay, go ahead. If you think these are good ideas, execute on that, and let me know how it goes. Maybe a month from now, you say, hey, Kylie, we tried A, B, and C. A and B really worked very well. C was a really crappy idea. You wasted a ton of my money executing on that dumb idea. But, we learned this and this and this, right? And now we're at like 50,000 users. Okay, we're getting, our relationship is getting better, right? And then I see that, wow, this is the team that can execute on its own model and has proven to show that kind of a growth in that short amount of time. That's really fun. Let me talk to my other investor buddies. Let's bring more investors into this. Because 500 startups we're not a lead investor most of the time.
Okay.
We're most of the time a follow-on investor. So what do we like to do? I would not want to invest in a company who cannot win the conviction of some local investors. So I love working with local investors. Okay. So I love to put a good round of people together and invest together.
So what turns you off about founders? Like, what are some things that just pisses you off?
Yeah, I mean, we talked a bit about bullshit, right? Which kind of turns anybody off in general. So we talked a bit about that. Second one is that founders who are overly fixated with their identity and kind of over fixated with their confidence about their model and their startup too soon.
Okay.
Right? So let me go a bit deeper into this. And it may be a kind of a reactionary effect, maybe because you're in a state of uncertainty, you know, as in the early stages of startup, perhaps, right? They're kind of fronting, right? Kind of fronting that they're really confident. So I think that maybe that leads back to the authenticity thing again, right? And maybe I've been talking too much about that, but I think it's just really important for them to get real about what's working and what's not working.
I mean,
So
so they have to be. What you're saying is that they can be real with investors, or certain investors, right? But I mean, in front of employees, it's a different thing, right? Because
well, let me go a bit deep. Okay, I'm gonna give a real example, right? When I built my first company, I've been building websites since I was 15 years old. So I've always fashioned myself as kind of like a product guy, right? Designer, working with teams of programmers. So all my best work I've done was behind a screen. When push came to shove, we had to create revenue, we had to pay the bills. I had to run out there and do sales. And I never looked at myself as a sales guy. And I was resisting this. I was so fixated with my identity as a product guy that I was resisting doing sales. Then one day I was just like, Kylie, you gotta be the best salesman on earth. You have to just become a sales monster if this is gonna work. And I have to reinvent who I am to become a sales monster so that I can produce results. And then in the first year, I closed 70 of Malaysia's largest advertisers as returning customers for my business. But if you'd asked me a year ago, I was like, no, I'm not a sales guy. I can't do that. You gotta hire a sales guy. You know, I'm kind of, and for some, of course, I mean, since you want to hire a sales guy. But what it takes, for example, fundraising. What I hear a lot is a lot of founders would confess and like, oh man, I just really hate this fundraising thing. You know, it's so annoying. I just want to work on my business again. You know, I just want to build my stuff. I have to, talk to investors in the fundraising. But that's part of the game, man. You gotta be a master fundraiser. You gotta switch your identity. So this is what I'm talking about: fixation with your own identity. Sometimes it's gonna limit you.
Can everyone do that? I mean, switching identities is really not easy, right?
Well, I would argue that we're all born with that stuff. If I'm gonna ask you, Terrence, when you were 6 years old, what were you like? Who are you? Right? And I'm gonna ask you again at 8 years old, who are you? You're like a different Terrence. I mean, I hope, right? Right? When you go 13 years old, you change, right? 13 years to 15, you go into high school, you go into college, you go into young adult. Your identity, your belief system, your world, it evolves, it changes, right? So once you start your startup, after you raise your first round and suddenly things start working, you raise a monster round next, maybe you're kind of fielding acquisition offers, or maybe you're going towards instilling a new round of management. You're not the manager anymore, right? You're building other leaders. Same thing. My expectation is that you're going to evolve. My assumption is you're going to evolve, you're going to change. So if a founder kind of assumes his own identity and is too fixated and doesn't change and evolve fast enough, he is going to be the bottleneck of his own growth.
Yeah, which leads us to another point, and we discussed this, the idea of eventuality. How does that gel with the idea of being fluid in terms of your identity? And we just explain that a little.
Okay. Okay, there's a lot of background discussion because he was kind of screening me if I were legit, right, before he brought me on stage. so we talked about some stuff. I think what you're talking about for the benefit of the audience was that it's kind of like a yin and a yang thing, and I spoke in a conference about this before. I mean, on one hand, you have the paradox of being completely fixated on a specific outcome. On the other hand, you're so flexible in who you are, your tactics, your approaches, what things you're experimenting with. So you've got that duality, right, of being completely fixated and obsessed about some stuff, but really flexible on other things. And what we talked about of the eventuality is that the fixated part is where you have to have the ultimate conviction of the space that you're in. For example, if let's say you're building a personal security app for smartphones, right? And you need to believe in the eventuality of that space. That out of every human being, one of the basic needs is the need to feel safe, the need to feel secure, right? And with the proliferation of mobile phones, the rapid rise of smartphones and dumb phones and so on and so forth, eventually there'll be apps which help you feel safer. So you fixate yourself on the eventuality, but what does the app look like? How about the features? How about the ways? Are you gonna do a party around it? How you gonna? Everything else of how you get there has got to be flexible. So, and it's funny how things like this work out. I mean, the story I tell was that when I first decided to leave the company I was working at to start a startup, I told a friend, I'm going to build a company, and I'm going to sell it for this amount of money. And I told the person, I said, I don't know what I'm going to build, but I'm just going to do that. When I first got the Groupon term sheet, it was the exact same amount. And I was shocked. I'm like, crap, I should set a larger number. But it's so weird how life plays those kind of tricks on you. Right? So I was fixated about a certain goal, and that's kind of subconscious, it's kind of inside of me. And I just found different ways to kind of do it. And with the startups that I'm working with now, the startups which I've invested in, I think outside, if you guys met Carousel from Singapore, I'm very happy the investors kind of looped me into that round, is that when I was speaking to them, like they had this bold conviction about the space. And they were really flexible about products, approaches of entering new markets, and that's a very healthy duality to hold.
Yeah, I guess being fixed in terms of the vision, I mean, the ideals you're pursuing, but fluid in how you execute. And
You got it, man.
yeah.
You got it.
Right, okay.
For investing in your startup, no kidding.
Well, next time maybe. Let's talk just a little bit about your experiences with SAYS and Who's What. How much do you sell those companies?
Sort of being the ultimate Chinaman, it's like we don't want to, so we try to keep that amount quiet.
Okay.
But of course, like those deals had very specific. Like for the Groupon one, it was very specific that because they bought a lot of companies in every country, and they don't want everybody to compare and stuff. So it's kept under the lid. But for the Sis.com one, it was a mix of cash and shares. $8 million US, so a mix of cash and shares.
Okay, yeah.
It's like a small Malaysian exit.
Yeah. Small start, right? But,
Well, I mean, the fun part about that SAYS exit is that the acquirer, Catcher Group, is they're bundling more companies in to eventually list that company. So my hope is that once they bundle it up and list it, it's going to be worth something. So the Catcher Group has done very successfully merging and listing iProperty as well as iCar. So iProperty is worth 300 odd million US dollars. iCar is about 150 odd million US dollars. So if they do the same for the thing that I sold to them, hopefully it's going to come back a bit more.
Okay. So a couple of points we can talk about is that
I mean, don't mind me hijacking kind of
please
your
do.
flow, right? But I think that this was kind of building up to something really cool.
Yeah.
What related to your earlier questions about Indonesia, what I look for in founders and all that stuff, there is a lot of startup dogma, that's what I call it. A lot of startup dogma going around.
Yeah.
Things people assume to be true. A lot of that is true in specific contexts for specific people. But if that's not your context, that's not going to be true for you. So there's tons of startups, and founders like kind of just soaking in all the drinking up the startup Kool-Aid, throwing out buzzwords and terms and different things. Like the other startup I invested in Thailand, Noonsoon, they don't buy a lot of the startup hype. They're really focused on their business, what are the levers which grow their business, and they execute on that stuff. So you're immune to startup dogma.
Okay.
You're not led by startup dogma. I think that's very important for a lot of early stage founders. You can use a lot of what you read and what you learn from others as a radar, a guiding system. But at the end of the day, it's like you versus the world, you versus your customers, and you versus your, and growing that stuff.
Okay. So just one final question and wrap up. So maybe just an example of lean startup. When does it not apply?
Okay, lean startup as it's touted, right? I think it's so powerful for testing a hypothesis you have, right? If you have certain guide, you want to discover something, it's good for verification. But where does that hypothesis come from?
Okay.
Where does that hypothesis come from? Where does that wild, intuitive vision or the idea come from? All that. So there is art and a science to it, and I think that recognizing the intuitive part of a founder, and even though it's not as rational at first, that's incredibly powerful. And then you can use lean startup methodology to rapidly learn whether you're right or wrong or to refine something. So that's kind of the way I look at it.
Okay.
And when you look at the scientific method for humanity in general,
Right.
they're facing the same issue. So Gary Kasparov, Peter Thiel, a lot of big picture thinkers are talking about this. Because people now rely on the scientific method in general for progress of humanity. But a long time ago, it was the science fiction writers
Okay.
who first proposed being on the moon first proposed a lot of the modern inventions we have today. So if science fiction led science. So where does science fiction come from? The imagination.
Okay, so with that, on that note, we'll end this panel. So thank you, Kylie, for your time. And if you're a startup founder, please approach Kylie. Thank you.
Yeah, happy to be pitched. All right, see you guys.